Hello, everyone. This is wonderful to see a more full house. I was so concerned with this weather and all that's been going on lately. It is a pleasure to see you all here. Thank you for making this time. My name is Andrew Westover. I'm the Eleanor McDonald Storza Deputy Director for Learning and Civic Engagement here at the High. And this program, as you probably know, is in conjunction with our current exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks, organized by the Art Institute of Chicago. Now, the exhibition is currently on view and will close on February 16, which is quite soon. So if you haven't already, you simply must go and see it before it departs us. At the end of the conversation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So in a moment, the screen will display for you a QR code, and I'll give directions as soon as that pops up. But in the meantime, I'll say a special thank you to High members who are here today. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. If you're not yet a member or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this program. Now, if we can go back to that QR code that I saw pop up there for just a moment, this is what we'll be using for questions for the Q&A at the end. So please, if you would, go ahead and take out your phone. I know you have one, and use this to open up the web page, and at any time during the conversation, you can type in your question. This way, it's a little bit more equitable, and hopefully you'll find it a good experience too. I'd also like to thank our generous supporters, exhibition series donors Delta Airlines Incorporated, Mr. Joseph H. Bolin Jr., the Faye S. and W. Barrett Howell Family Foundation, Harry Norman Realtors, Wish Foundation, and benefactor exhibition series supporters Robin and Hilton Howell. And of course, thank you to the full High team for their essential support making this program happen. This evening, we are joined by three distinguished speakers. You've already seen their bios online and on the screen, so I will not belabor by repeating them, but I will simply say now that we are honored and excited to hear from three luminaries this evening. Art Institute of Chicago Curator and co-curator of the exhibition, Sarah Kelly Oehler, landscape architect Beka Sturges, and the High's new Associate Curator of American Art, Anni Pullagura. Please join me in welcoming all three of our speakers. And to begin, each of our speakers will offer a few words sort of situating themselves relative to the exhibition and its topic. I won't belabor this any further. I'd love to turn it over to Sarah to begin.
All right. I'm hoping this is working now. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for being here tonight on what, for a Chicagoan, is a lovely evening. But I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted that the show could come here to Atlanta. It's been really meaningful working with the High Museum on displaying the show here, and being part of this program is a wonderful capstone to that. And so like Andrew, I hope you've all had a chance to see it, but if you haven't, then I hope we're whetting your appetite. So can we go to the next slide? So Andrew asked us to position ourselves in relationship to Georgia O'Keeffe, and I thought actually it would make sense to talk a little bit about how I arrived with my co-curator, Annalisa Madsen, at the exhibition itself, sort of what drove us with it. And the exhibition explores what is in fact a very little known aspect of O'Keeffe's work, which is her paintings of New York City. And the project developed out of my interest in one painting in particular, the one that you see on the screen now, which is called The Shelton with Sunspots. And it is a blazingly beautiful painting of a Manhattan skyscraper, and the skyscraper that O'Keeffe called her home. Now, the museum, the Art Institute, has actually a pretty wonderful collection of O'Keeffe paintings, thanks to O'Keeffe herself. But it's the Shelton with Sunspots that always surprises our visitors. They really look at it and are just flabbergasted that this is a painting by O'Keeffe, because it is so unexpected. They really didn't know that she painted landscapes that were of New York City, and certainly not ones that incorporate the built environment and nature in such a tremendous way. Can you go to the next slide, please? So an artist like O'Keeffe, I think, can, for many people, seem a little familiar, a little old hat. You might think everything has been said about O'Keeffe. But what I discovered sort of very quickly upon working with the Shelton in our collection is that in fact her Manhattan paintings and pastels and drawings really were understudied. It's a group of about 25 works that she created in a very intense period in the late 1920s. And so it sparked many just fundamental research questions for us. And so I thought I would share a little bit of that process. You know, the number one question was, why did she actually start painting Manhattan at this very particular moment in her life, even though she'd been living there for 7 or 8 years already? So the chronology of this was just not working out for us. And, you know, but we also wanted to dig into the paintings themselves. What was she trying to do in them? What was she trying to express? How do they relate to one another? And how does she actually envision, sorry, as I fumble my pages, how does she actually envision the city? Is she looking up at it consistently? Yes. Sometimes she's looking down at it, though. So she's taking on different viewpoints onto the city. And that was something that was clearly an important choice for her. So we wanted to think about those aspects. We wanted to think about how she brought nature into the built environment. And we wanted to think about how this was her home, her inspiration, and so much more for her. The actual fact of the Shelton Hotel was the space she lived in. She painted in it. She also painted from it, like looking out the window, and she walked around it and painted other things. Now, next slide, please. But I think what became very clear is that O'Keeffe is not a one-trick pony. She really wasn't an artist who would focus on one subject to the exclusion of others at any one point in her career. She really was a bold artist who constantly experimented and pushed herself to experiment across a range of subject matter. So very quickly, another set of questions we looked at was to think about how she was thinking about other paintings, other subjects at this time. What else was she creating that weren't urban? What other landscapes was she looking at? What other subjects was she looking at? And stylistically, how do these all connect? How do her urban paintings and her non-urban paintings really connect with one another? And so this is a case where the skyscraper paintings seem radically different from everything else she's doing, but in fact, there's an enormous number of sort of stylistic through lines that we started identifying. And I'll just tell you a little bit about, there's this one critic in 1927 who wrote this rather florid review of O'Keeffe's works, but it had this incredible analogy, basically likening O'Keeffe's work to a plant, which I think is really interesting. But that essentially there was a central stalk, you know, the trunk of a plant or a tree, with then shoots and leaves coming off of it. And so essentially what he's talking about is the idea of O'Keeffe as a modernist painter as sort of the trunk, and then fundamentally all of these different subjects, flowers, skyscrapers, abstractions, small buildings, big buildings, coming off as the different shoots and leaves. And so it was really an analogy that helped us think about how this all connected together. And then just a few other things we were thinking about. We definitely wanted to think about New Mexico. Everybody thinks of O'Keeffe as a New Mexico artist, a Southwestern artist, but we're really looking at what happened before she went to the Southwest and what happened when she went to the Southwest. And think about the ongoing connections between the locations in her life. And I think something that we should probably talk about is that O'Keeffe was very much rooted in the idea of place, but she was not ever fixed in place. So at this point, she is moving between Manhattan, Lake George, and New Mexico consistently. And I think that's a significant factor. And then I forgot to advance the slides because I'm not used to saying that, but there's the New Mexico slide for you. And then if you go to the last one. The final thing that we were really also thinking about is what all of this meant for her reputation. How was she showing her urban paintings at a point when she was not the famous artist of the Southwest? I think that's hard for us to wrap our brains around, but this is the moment before she's famous. She's trying to become famous. And so how is she exhibiting all of her paintings at this time? What were her exhibition practices? And you can see even in this image, she's putting them all together. She's letting them live with one another. And so thinking about her own preferences for displaying her art and also how they were being received by critics and patrons at the time was something that was important. This is the moment where she starts earning real money, and that's also something that's very important for a young Georgia O'Keeffe. And so I think with that, I will stop because I've been rambling on, but thank you for humoring me, and I'll turn it over to Annie, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And good evening, everyone. It's really nice to see you all. My name is Anni Pullagura. I am the new Associate Curator of American Art at the High, and I'm very pleased to be here. It's actually, I counted down, week 9 for me in this role. So this is a really warm welcome, and what a great way to begin my tenure with this really fantastic exhibition. So thank you so much to the Art Institute of Chicago, to Sarah and Annalise for this really brilliant close look at an artist that I think we all have many feelings for, and are hopefully through this exhibition be able to see in a new, interesting way. Because I kind of came in and when this exhibition was already kind of in place, I do want to give a special shout out to my colleagues, our Chief Curator Kevin Tucker and our Curatorial Research Associate Colin Cuso, who really shepherded and steered our installation of this exhibition here in Atlanta. So thank you to the whole team at the High. Because I am so new, and I was given the task to kind of think about the relationship with O'Keeffe that I have, but also thinking about my relationship with O'Keeffe in terms of what does it mean to bring the show here to Atlanta, and the significance for the High's collection. I'm still learning the collection, again, and it's a collection that has a lot to love and a lot to fall in love with. And one of the key things that kind of keeps coming out for me, and has always kind of been a key word for me when I'm thinking about O'Keeffe's paintings, is the key word of perspective. And that's a really capacious word. Perspective means and can mean a lot of different things. And we see that word evoked a lot in O'Keeffe's paintings, I think, in her practice. We always think of O'Keeffe through her use of scale, the use of the close cropped image, her use of the canvas, really filling out the canvas with her variety of subject matter, her orientation, her angles, all these different ways that perspective is clearly an important compositional motif and device for her. But I also want to ask us to think about perspective in O'Keeffe as a device for the command of attention. By simply giving us a new perspective on maybe an unfamiliar or familiar object, I think she's really asking us the question of what is it that we pay attention to in our natural worlds? And then that's the question that I think O'Keeffe is asking of herself in her own practice. She's an artist who would frequently take walks wherever she was. She was always outdoors. And in these walks, she was experiencing her visual and natural worlds and asking that question of herself is what do I pay attention to and what am I seeing differently? And how can I translate that experience into the painterly sense, into the pictorial realm. So I really wanted to think about this idea of perspective and how this sense of paying attention to, and then asking us as viewers to pay attention to familiar objects in a new way, how that is also a through line through her practice in terms of how that performs itself onto the canvas and into her compositions. So this work that, this image that you see on the slide now is a piece that is in the High's collection. It's a treasured work that we have of O'Keeffe, O Red Canna, from 1919. So a few years before she really dives into her skyscraper images in the 20s. But already you can kind of see those compositional narratives already taking shape in just this picture, and in many of her floral pictures at this time, right? You have the elongated stem of the canna leaf, that vertical kind of reach of towards the sky that is filling the center of the canvas and really expanding upon the canvas. It's the use of that device again of that close crop, but also the formal relationship that she's navigated onto the canvas in terms of how she's dividing her composition and that use of that vertical structure, which, if you go to the next slide, is of course echoed in her actual skyscraper pictures. Again, that kind of sense of thinking about the presence of architectural elements in the organic world that she again sees in the urban landscape, the urban world, or the man-made world. And so I really want to think about how that sense of perspective, that the things that she's paying attention to are echoing in every single iteration or every subject that she takes up in her work. Something that O'Keeffe frequently talked about when people were asking her about her floral pictures, especially when she started making them at much larger scale, is, around why would she do so. She says something to the effect of, people will be startled, and perhaps because they'll be startled, they'll stop and they'll pay attention and they'll look. And she says that's what they did, right? They would stop and look. So I also want to think about that sense of, that command of attention that a new perspective gives you is also a way of unsettling you from from the assumptions you had of what you are taking for granted or taking, perhaps not paying attention to it in the world around you. And I think that's something that's an aspect or an attitude that O'Keeffe that for an artist like O'Keeffe is so generative. It's something that sense of being unsettled and being ready to be unsettled, and then translating that work or that experience, that really kind of difficult, ephemeral feeling of being startled, into visual terms on the painting canvas. So I just wanted to show a couple more images about just the methods and techniques and kind of the objects, and if you can put yourself in O'Keeffe's shoes. So this is a photograph that was taken in 1980 of her home in New Mexico, where you can see that she's gathered the rocks, the snake skeletons, the thrush that you can imagine her on her walks, and bringing this back to her studio, which is something that she did frequently throughout her life. Even when she started going to New Mexico while still living in New York, there was that lovely quote of she would just mail barrels and boxes of bones and stones back to New York to her studio to paint from again. And again, when she's drawing on these kind of natural objects at such a small scale and then blowing them up at such large scale, she's taking that familiar object and completely making it unfamiliar to us into this new perspective. And just by the way, this is a habit that I think artists just do in general. I have a lot of artists who are friends of mine. I know whenever I go on walks with them to make sure I'm wearing lots of heavy pockets, because inevitably they'll be going around collecting things that will inspire and perhaps spark the next project for them. So that's something that I always reminded of when I think about O'Keeffe's own methods for how enchanted she was by the world around her. And the next slide. And this is something that she incorporated into her practice, quite frequently. If she wasn't able to carry a physical artifact of the world around her, she would make images. So this is the photograph that she took during a 1939 visit to Hawaii. That she made, and she was on a coastline looking down and was just enchanted by the ocean tide coming across this rocky shoreline, and made this photograph. And what I love about this particular image, and what she talks about later on in her letters, and she was a very prolific writer, so we know that she thinks about this, is how at first glance you have this really beautiful image of the tide coming across shore, but it also could be, you can also see the allusions to a fabric of lace or a tulle dress being draped across a dark surface, or even like the decaying a petal that's kind of decaying or kind of withering or dried up at the end. So these allusions to different kinds of ideas that are just evoked in just this one image that she's making. And she talks about that in her practice often, that she was constantly experiencing sensations in the natural world that she would then be compelled to try to evoke and capture into a painted sense. And that struggle, that kind of impulse to capture that and translate that into visual terms, I think is an important one. So I'm going to stop here because I've gone on for a while. We'll go to the next slide.
Thank you. So I'm Beka Sturges, and am a landscape architect who is working on the new exhibition building at the O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe in New Mexico. And the O'Keeffe does house, I think Sarah probably knows better than me, but they basically opened with her estate and have increased their holdings, I think, by more than 100% over the last 15 years. So it is a museum that has grown very rapidly since George O'Keeffe died. And so this expansion really recognizes the attention that her work has continued to have, and the number of people who travel from around the globe to come and connect with her. One of the giant questions and challenges of the project is that George O'Keeffe is a artist who also really deeply resonates with people as a person. So she is a kind of hero figure, I think, for many people, and there is a kind of pilgrimage to come and connect with her when people want to see her works. But her homes, which the museum does run and manage, Ghost Ranch and Abiquiu, are very fragile places. They're very small. And to care for them means that it's very limited numbers of people who are actually able to go and, actually look out her bedroom window and see exactly what she saw. But the desire to understand Georgia O'Keeffe in detail and to see the world as she saw it is very, very deep. So our question, which is a very difficult question, was how can we make that sense of home that she had, that partly motivated her move from New York, which wasn't complete, she did keep going back, but to New Mexico, how could we give that sense of home in downtown Santa Fe to people in case they weren't able to make that further distant travel to Ghost Ranch or Abiquiu? And it's hard to transport someone's home, the domestic scale, the wildness of Pedernal and those giant landscapes, to a downtown condition. And so we asked the question of how can we bring what George O'Keeffe cared about and lived with in a very immediate way. And we turned to that idea of sort of intimacy and foreground. And also we really turned to how much she aligned the actions of her everyday life with her works of art as much as a person could, right? So she was so disciplined about what she grew and what she ate. And the garden was such a central part of how she organized her life, particularly in the winter. It's why she moved to Abiquiu, because she couldn't grow what she ate at Ghost Ranch. There wasn't enough water. And so we said, well, let's have a harvest garden. Let's grow things. And let's also really, there were some incredibly beautiful just singular trees on the property already. An ancient double cottonwood, a really old, gnarled apple tree. And so we thought if we could celebrate these sort of individual trees the way she did in her paintings, this place would start to evoke in a framed way some of the very close encounters with nature and almost the strangeness of the natural world that her works celebrate for people who came to the museum. So we are getting into the ground right now with that project, but I think it's really interesting to recognize, and we've tried to bring this forward, that O'Keeffe really understood and thought a lot about native plants and the toughness of plants and the mortality of plants and the connection to our own health with what we grow in a way that I think feels very current today, but was quite either ahead of its time or just truly idiosyncratic or eccentric at the moment when she actually lived.
Thank you so much. This, as you can tell, we've got 3 magnificent perspectives on a topic that is only going to unfurl further. So we'll go ahead and change over the slides now to a rotating cast that allows you to walk through the exhibition alongside us. And as that transition happens, I'll turn to my first question, which is largely about a thread that I think winds through each of your presentations. The question of materiality. What was materiality for Georgia O'Keeffe? How do we see it evidenced across her body of work? And particularly in this exhibition, across the diversity of output that it contains, materiality, I think each of you could offer a different lens perhaps, but I don't know, perhaps I could ask you to start, Sarah?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So I think I would start by thinking about her paintings themselves, and we were talking about this a little previously before, and just how very precise they are, although there is brushwork evident. So I think that that's somewhat unexpected with O'Keeffe. You actually have a notion from reproductions of her paintings that they are so pristine as to not show any brushwork, but that's actually not the case. But they are, in fact, quite precise in their contours and their outlines. And so one of my favorite small group of works in the show is a group of drawings that she did that are on loan from the O'Keeffe Museum. And they're just these wonderful freehand little outlines of buildings, of the New York City skyline. And this is because with O'Keeffe, as was said, she walked everywhere. She was out there, and it was always about this immediate perception that she wanted. And so she's really moving from this brief note to herself into somehow fully fleshed out, immaculately beautiful, precise, colorful paintings. And I think that's a really fascinating dynamic that, this is an artist. There's the Shelton with Sunspots that I showed earlier is in our collection. It's actually one of 6 paintings, we think, that she did of the Shelton, where she destroyed 4 of them. And that's because she wasn't happy with their materiality. Something went wrong. And so her decision was always to destroy rather than keep something that didn't sort of hold up to her own standard. And I think that is about the material of it, sort of the very material nature of what would happen when it went wrong was that the surface would get thicker, she would have to rework things, and it wouldn't have that very eloquent sort of sense of fine line that you see. So I'm going to start there. I don't know if that gets anywhere with what you were going with, but I do think it all can be traced to these beautiful little drawings that are about being out in the world.
I think that's really, really apt. And what I love about that is how it points towards how you were talking, Beka, about those specific trees and the attention. I wonder if you could maybe dig in there a bit, but also in the way that you consider materiality.
Yeah, I mean, I think you get such a sense from her paintings and from her drawings and from the skulls on the wall or the even the dead trunks. She was constantly picking up not just rocks and skulls, which we hear so much about, but also parts of plants, which I'm obviously very interested in, and seeds. She had an amazing seed catalog too, which she kept in the same way that she kept her art supplies. So I just think this sense of the minerality of the world and that, what you feel in your skin and your eyes and your breath and the sense of an expanse, that the small can make the very large world somehow feel so important, is just something that I think is a recurrent encounter when you think about her work, and is something that we have tried very hard to do when we've been working on this new garden, which is to use even the surface as the kinds of stones and rocks from the Chama River, and to turn those into a concrete that can be durable for larger people. And we were looking at whether or not we could make a large sort of water table so that children could come and place stones, and that we could engage sort of people who visited with the same kinds of collection activities that she was so prone to. So I think it's hard to imagine O'Keeffe without thinking about this sort of desire to move, to get out there, and then to actually collect and look and study at what you collect.
I heard you mention concrete.
Yes.
And I know that Annie has particular opinions about concrete and its own materiality, so maybe I'll ask sideways that you start there and then bring us back around.
I'm getting called out. Yeah, so my unusual opinion about concrete is that I find it very soft. Of course, not when you fall on it, and not when you are unexpectedly encountered with it. But with an artist like O'Keeffe, I think the softness comes from how she's translating that material onto the canvas. It's a little bit about what you were saying earlier, Sarah, about this, this discipline she had, this economy she has with her pigments, her paints, and how she's layering them onto her canvas to evoke a certain idea. She doesn't want you to really think about the presence of the artist's hand. She's not really asking you to think about anything except being transported into this particular composition and the ideas and the feelings, really, the emotions that are behind it, that she's asking you to experience and witness with her. And that translation of material, I think, is what is so interesting to me about that sense of softness, of how she is, that work that we have that Chicago, that's right there actually, this, Shelton with sunspots right in the center. To me, that sense of the sun biting out, she talks about it, and she was saying that she was walking on the streets and looked up, and it looked like the sun was taking a bite out of the building. And how lovely of that, of an image to kind of experience, but then how amazing is that as an emotion that she's then trying to translate to this really evocative and beautiful composition, where the sun is quite literally eating up the side of this building with this bright glare and the sunspots, and you're immediately transported back to moments where you've experienced that, you know, when looking up, walking around, and experience the natural world in ways that astonish you.
One thing that I really enjoy too about this conversation, and just any time I'm in the galleries in this exhibition, is I hear people talking about Georgia O'Keeffe. There's such a presence of who she is, or how she might have moved through the world, or how she might have perceived or been perceived. And I think it is worth it for us to spend a bit of time thinking about Georgia O'Keeffe the person. So I wonder, maybe, Sarah, I'm sorry I keep leaning on you, but I'm gonna do it one more time here and just ask, as you spent, I wanna say you said over 8 years on this exhibition? Six years on an exhibition is still nothing to slight at. Although exhibitions obviously take a lot of time, and we're grateful for all of our curators who spend that time. But that's enough time to have some sense of the woman, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I will tell you a story that will embarrass my husband because he is my everyman. And I will say that early on in this project, he said to me, I've never seen O'Keeffe as a young woman. You know, that in his mind, O'Keeffe was this older woman always. You know, I mean, he and I are both old enough that our lives overlapped with hers, even though I don't think he certainly had any clue. And he's an engineer. But ultimately, you know, I think that one of the things that I began really thinking about is that O'Keeffe in this moment in the 20s is setting the stage for O'Keeffe as we come to know her. And I think it's important that she's also already in her 40s, by the way, in the 1920s. So she's not like fresh out of, you know, high school. But she's already very self-determined. She is already very adamant about the direction she wants to go in. She is willing to completely flout and push back against the people who don't want her doing what she wants to do. And I think that is something that sort of sustains her across her entire career. And I will say that's something that I admire tremendously about her, just sort of recognizing how utterly committed she was to her own project and making it her own project. You know, whether it be the opposition, subtle or sometimes not subtle, of her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, who was also her dealer and, you know, the gallery owner who showed her works. You know, she was still going to keep going. And so I think that that's one of the things that I really began to love about her as a person, was just this sort of through and through commitment that manifested across her entire career. So that even though as a young woman she wasn't famous, she wasn't yet making money, she wasn't, you know, yet the Southwestern artist we know, she was already just absolutely making sure she was going to get there. So.
Annie, how do you hold O'Keeffe the person?
She's a very mythic person in a lot of ways, right? She looms large even for people who have just a tangential experience or relationship to the history of American art. You know, that she's still a figure that I think everyone has some degree of familiarity with, and I think in that sense it contributes to this really interesting kind of public figure that exists in some other kind of off-world. But one of the aspects of her life that I think is so significant is how many personalities or how many personas that she took up of herself, right? She had a very carefully crafted public image that she expressed through her dress, through the way that she lived her life, how she was photographed, for example. But she also was a teacher for a large portion of her life, and I think that's an important aspect of the way that she thinks about, the practice of art, her discipline, the choices that she would make. I think that's experienced in the persona of being a teacher, and of wanting to also experiment and continue to push herself through a very decades-long career, right? She started painting and working in art when she was 15 or so, and of course lived several decades after that. So that's a long, just a few, but a long time to constantly challenge yourself. And I think that's a teacher's spirit as well as a student's spirit in terms of that sense of creativity that really drove her. And so those are the aspects, I think, of her persona that are significant to kind of keep in mind, is that, she had all these other ways that she would express herself through her work, through her teaching, through her practice, and so forth.
I really appreciate that. Can I press a little further on, I like how you introduced her as a woman of many possibilities here. Could you give us maybe a bit more texture of some of the ways that she chose to present herself, or some of the things that she oriented towards in those images, or in her style, or any of those directions?
I mean, one of the things that I think, when we think of images of O'Keeffe, we always think of that really lovely little hat, the bowler hat she would wear, the cape that she and Stieglitz would always wear, that really simple gray, or monochromatic, dress with the white collar, for example. I mean, there's a certain sense of style that she had that was so significant, and she was very careful on how she presented that self. This was a time when the artist was considered, or the 1910s, 1920s, was a moment when artists were bohemian. They had a certain kind of, maybe they still do, have a certain sense of what it means to be an artist in public, is how you present yourself, how you present this kind of, this persona of the artist, capital A. And she was very much against, she didn't participate in that, and not in certain degrees. She participated in other ways, right? That carrying on that style that she had, now she expressed herself in public, was of course still adding to this kind of mythic kind of persona that she still carried. But I think it's interesting thinking about how she chose to express herself in her dress, her performance, how she moved in public, and so forth.
Thank you so much. Beka.
I think there are a number of ways that her persona comes forward. I'm maybe most sensitive to thinking about the way that her homes and her dress, and even the way I think she organized her calendar, actually. I would say her when she woke up all through the day, she was super routine oriented. And I think she wanted and needed actually an enormous amount of control over her day. But there's a early letter, I think, to one of her best friends from maybe college, where she was saying, I worked all day, and that's the best, that it was grand or something, it's like an old-fashioned word, but she's like, that's what my life is about, is painting. And I think what you see as a through line is a set of decisions at almost every age to enable her to focus on making art. And one of the things that we were talking about as we prepared is that actually in those New York years, for many of those years, she was living at the Shelton, which is a hotel. And so she didn't have to cook. She didn't have to clean. And there are a number of really wonderful letters where she talks about her home spaces. And even if she had access to 2 rooms or even 1 room, she would divide this space so she could leave all her art supplies out so it would be efficient and they would be organized, and she didn't have to waste time putting them away at the night and then taking them back out. And when they lived in only 3 bedrooms or whatever at the Shelton, 1 whole room became her studio so that she could concentrate as much of every day as possible on making work. And the last thing that I would say is I think she was an amazing friend. And so when you look at her life, there are such beautiful photographs taken by Ansel Adams, not just by many people. And you can see when they photograph her that they're taken with her. There's sort of love in the lens, I would say. And her letters are some of the best letters I've ever read. I would recommend them to all of you. They are so full of life. They're so current. She doesn't waste words, I think she didn't waste time. And so if she loved someone, she said, I loved our walk. The moon struck your eyes. And I think I feel awkward. It's like you're seducing me. So I think she was, in some way, so wanted to be so vital that she was very seductive. Even though she didn't wear makeup and she wore this stark, almost priest-like dress, there was something very, very alluring about her vitality and discipline.
Can I add to that a little bit? Because I totally agree with everything you just said about how sort of seductive she was for many people. But I think you also hit the nail on the head. You used the word control. And I think that is such a defining word for O'Keeffe. And, one of the aspects that, again, I thought a lot about with the show was her relationship with Stieglitz, actually. Because in many ways, they had a very, if they were on Facebook, it's complicated. But, they had a very complex relationship, one that I think was incredibly sort of generative in many ways and also destructive probably in other ways. But, but the 20s, before she exerts this control, the 20s is when she's figuring out she doesn't control everything. She can't control critics. She can't control quite yet how her image is being portrayed and how it's being perceived and what that is doing for her career. So I do think that the sort of way that she controls her public persona is a way of making sure, that she gets to be the agent, be the authority. But I do think there is a way that control really manifests in her paintings. The way that they are to go back to materiality, they are controlled paintings. And I think that's also really important for her. So, but of course they are paintings that bring together the hard and the soft, the nature and the built environment, concrete and and clouds all at once, in this wonderful, complex dichotomy.
That's where I'd love to push for our next question. This land of concrete and clouds. How, in O'Keeffe's work, do we ultimately see landscapes? Landscape is a term that, at the museum, when we have young people come and we start thinking about landscape, we have sort of prescribed notions. Oftentimes we're outdoors, oftentimes there's a horizon, there's sort of a this is a traditional landscape. And even in the images we've seen here, a lot of the edges of what we'd use to define landscape seem to be blurring very quickly. So I'd love to hear from each of you how you think about this work in relation to really what is a landscape. And maybe, Beka, we'll start with you this time.
Okay, great. I think as a landscape architect, I think about the question of what a landscape is a lot, because in some ways it's everything that happens outside. And I almost want to go to, when I think about O'Keeffe and her work and landscape, I think she says it sort of again and again in different ways, I'm most comfortable outside. And if you think about the ways that she selected homes, if it was just going to be for a few months, or if she, if you think about her home at Ghost Ranch, and maybe Abiquiu, she needed light. She needed she didn't like to waste time or money, and so she mostly didn't make major renovations. But if she didn't have adequate access, large windows to the outside, she was really unhappy. I think truly almost in a depression. And so she's a person that even when she was inside, she was sort of craving to be her face against the window. And I think some of her most interesting works are these ones where there's some indication that there's a window or there's frame or there's curtain, and you have this sense of the release that you can experience, the freedom that can happen when you're outside. And I think the painting of hers that I think about the most as it relates to landscape is it's actually a series that she did inspired by the views looking out the window of an airplane. And these large cloud paintings where she's looking down on the clouds. But she's looking through a window, right? It's an airplane window when she's framing those. And so I think to me, she expanded, I think, our sense of what a landscape is and even where a landscape occurs. And I might take it so far as to say that even when she was drawing those rocks inside, she's sort of bringing the landscape inside the home. I'll add one last thing, because now I'm probably talking too much, but she had almost, when her homes were described, even her like college or Texas teaching home, there was very little furniture that she had. People said they were stark, uncomfortable, but there was almost always a plant. So like the idea that there was a red geranium in one of her early, and then if you look at the pictures of Ghost Ranch, there are always 3 or 4 plants. You see only paintbrushes, plants, and skulls. There's like nothing there. But she did try to bring always something living into her interior. I don't know who goes next.
Annie, I'm wondering if you could take us on a landscape journey as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about with this exhibition and spending time with the New York New York pictures, actually, I gave that away, is how much the landscape actually is a portrait for O'Keeffe. And what would it offer us in terms of thinking about what landscape means for O'Keeffe in terms of her subject matter, to think about these new skyscraper pictures as portraits. And portraits not just of New York, but portraits of New York as she experienced it in this one moment of time. This was a moment where skyscrapers, the skyline of New York, the structure, the built environment was rapidly changing, and she was witnessing this. And some of the things that were inspiring her to begin painting the skyscraper pictures was on these walks, and she would see her skyline or her view, her horizons kind of changing around her, and trying to capture that feeling. I think is something that maybe have been a motivation in some ways. And so the skylines that we're witnessing in her even abstracted iterations of the New York skyscraper pictures are images of a moment in New York that doesn't even exist for us anymore, right? That's already a past moment. So I'm wondering how we can think about the landscapes that she would pursue, whether it was the skyscraper images, or whether it was her images of the Southwest, or whether it was her pictures of even the florals at large scale, are moments and portraits of a land and her relationship to that land or that place in that moment of time, and documenting that for herself, or that emotion that she experienced in that moment through that kind of pictorial sense.
I really like how you keep pulling us back to a sense of a relationship with land and an emotive one, because I think it can be easy to see these as beautiful depictions and miss that really strong undercurrent or overcurrent of emotion.
And just really quickly, it's something that she expressed herself, right? She was really early on in her practice, she was walking around, again, another hike of hers, and realizing that she was seeing mist over like a body of water, I believe it was, and just being really struck that, she went home and tried to paint it, and it just wasn't really working out. And she talked a little bit, she wrote letters to her sister saying, well, I think what I was trying to capture was the feeling of being there, of witnessing that, and how can I translate that emotion of being in this landscape, witnessing this kind of natural moment that was around her, and translating that into the painting was the real motivation.
Sarah, how do you think about landscape?
I mean, I've had such good answers from both of my colleagues here that I'm trying to think of what I can add. I mean, ultimately, I think that O'Keeffe wasn't afraid to create a vertical landscape. We think of horizontal as being sort of fundamental to the idea of landscape. And so I would agree that they're portraits. I mean, that's maybe why O'Keeffe is so tremendously interesting, is because her paintings are not just one thing ever. They really are, they can be portraits and landscapes and somehow abstractions all at the same time. Sometimes you don't know what that is. And, and they are also registers of some experience or emotion that she had. And, and I think that that's what gives her this lasting power, but that ultimately, I mentioned earlier that that the chronology didn't make sense for us in some ways. So O'Keeffe, before she moved into the Shelton, I think it's actually interesting to know, she's basically a freeloader. So she and Stieglitz were like living off of Stieglitz's family in like a series of apartments that they would just sort of squat in, and in New York City. And they were all like 3-story, old brownstones in New York. And so to go back to this idea of light and sort of the new experience, that is what the Shelton gave her, was all of a sudden an urban landscape. Where she had, if you look at her paintings of Lake George, you see these vistas across the lake. If you look at paintings out in Southwest, you see vistas from one mesa to the next. And when she's in New York and she's 30 stories up, she's painting the same view from above. It's interesting because there's a sort of fundamental similarity there between how she's looking at perspective and land, regardless of where she is. But certainly it's because the Shelton gave her views and windows, and that's what she talked about in her lovely letters constantly. Every single apartment she described said, it's a northeast view, it's a this view. She's describing what the direction is. That's most important.
Incredible.
Yeah.
I'd love to now turn to your questions. So if you haven't already, thank you so much. If you haven't already, feel free to submit. And also, if you haven't already seen, there's a little way that you can upvote. So if there's another person's question that you particularly like and want to be sure I see, upvote it. That would be helpful to me. So our first one here, this is really helpful. Did art museums support O'Keeffe's work while she was a living artist? Or did she have to die to receive recognition, like so many artists that have come before her?
I would love to take this one because this is a subject that I've thought about a lot. So O'Keeffe showed in the early parts of her career exclusively at Stieglitz's gallery, various different galleries. And, and these were elite spaces, no question about it. But in 1943, I am proud to say, the Art Institute offered her her first ever museum retrospective. And this is the moment that she actually showed for the very first time outside of New York City, and to a national audience, and also was picked up by like the AP. And so you see like reviews of the show appearing in strange, newspapers around the country that have no idea. They haven't seen the show. But, and so, yes, to answer the question, the answer is absolutely museums do support her career. Cleveland buys a flower painting, the first one in 1930, to go into a museum collection. So there's early acquisitions being made by museums as well as exhibitions, increasingly throughout her life. I don't know if you all want to add to that, but.
We have plenty of questions, don't worry. Let's turn to this one. From the letters, did she like New York? The paintings look perhaps loving. This person says, I feel like in my understanding of her, she may have preferred wild settings or being alone. How did she feel about city life? Do we know anything of her sentiment with regard to the city?
I can offer a few. I'm not an expert in the same way as Sarah, but I have read, a fair amount. So I'm an amateur.
I think you're more than an amateur at this point.
Well, I'm a fangirl, maybe. But I think I don't think it's a simple answer. I think there are things about New York that were so important to her because she was so driven to be a deep artist, and the art community. I'm just thinking about her experience with Chase as a professor. She wanted the best teaching, she wanted the best community, she wanted the best gallery experiences, and New York, even today, is one of the epicenters of people who are driven to make art and to celebrate art, and so that was incredibly important to her. She liked also to be alone. And I think one of the things that was incredibly hard for her about being in New York was partly also what was hard for her about being with Stieglitz, which was the social, the constant contact with other people, which she found very, very draining and very, very difficult. And I'll leave my comments there.
Tell if that was a yes or no. Cool. Yeah, Sarah.
And the only thing I would add, I mean, I think that it is a sort of love-hate relationship, absolutely, because she needs New York. She's also only there in the winter months. You know, she's escaping New York for better places, rural places in the summer, in the spring and summer. And so I think it's in many ways a business relationship. But again, that's why she brings nature into it, was to give her that release, so to speak. And I would just add also, like, she loved the Shelton because she was 30 floors above everybody. I mean, it's not quiet in New York. Certainly not if you're in a second, story brownstone, even in 1925. But it is very quiet on the 30th floor of the Shelton Hotel. So I think that was important too.
I'm looking at time. I'm trying to combine questions artfully. If I do it inartfully, I apologize. There's two questions that I think are really fascinating and I think are related to one another. One is the relationship between her and her husband. One is the relationship between her and gender. And then one is sort of how the world sees her in relation to her husband and gender. Tiny question to end on.
2 minutes.
I'm also very obviously not even putting verbs on these things because they are so complicated, and complicated itself is a cop-out. Any texture you'd like to add to this morass that I've dumped on the stage? I would love to hear your thoughts.
Can I start? So I'm going to start with the issue of gender, because I actually think that that's a really compelling idea, which is she was certainly aware she was a woman. She did not want to be a woman artist as an adjective. She didn't want to be the great woman artist. She wanted to be the great artist. And so I think she had it imposed upon her. So to get to the second half of that question, gender was something that there's no question, there are sort of societal constraints that came with it, like expectations of what a woman should paint, what a woman shouldn't paint, that she basically just said, I don't care. So that's where she was just going to keep going in her own way. So she has things put upon her that she tended to just try to push off as much as she possibly could when it came to gender. And I think there's much to add there, but that's where I'll start.
And how this relates to her relationship with Stieglitz, which is a thorny issue for that. We could have a whole other hour and would not come anywhere close to unraveling what that might have been like. But that certainly was a caveat to some of this experience of her relationship to her gender and how that played out in public, right? And so the way that, how he would present the work really quite early on in terms of encouraging certain types of production, the floral pieces and not the skyscrapers, so forth, that the skyscrapers were left to the men and not to an artist like O'Keeffe. And how she would, again, be really deliberate in not following that line and choosing, again, to continue to do what she knew she had to do for her own practice. But I think it's important to think about the relationship and the world that she was working in, her circle of friends, that was the Stieglitz circle, and thinking about how that was also an aspect of the work. Her time in Lake George around Stieglitz's family and keeping home and thinking about some of that aspect was also a labor that she was experiencing alongside trying to forge this career for herself. So I think there are many multiple layers to this relationship with Stieglitz and how that might have impacted this expectation that was put upon her by the public, especially in largely an art critic world, about what her paintings might mean and had to mean because of who she happened to be.
And I'll add, and this might throw it over to you, Beka, a little bit, but ultimately, of course, she goes to the Southwest. She's invited. I mean, she has a friend who's heading out there, but she goes there in part because she also wants to get away from Stieglitz. So there is that element of being alone, of having freedom sort of away from him every summer. He never goes to the Southwest, not once. And I think she probably was very happy with that. But I do think that the Southwest offered that as well. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I think she made unusually strong friendships with men and with women, which I think is unusual even today for people to have lots of close friends and then to have close friends across gender is unusual. I think there were romances, and it's not clear, based on the evidence at least that I'm aware of, about sort of were they just romances in words and time spent together on beautiful walks, or did things go further than that? I think there are questions around that. One of the things that I learned recently reading more was that, and I had wondered, were they challenged to have children? But she was someone who was so close with her siblings, and her family was so important to her, and also Stieglitz's family was so important to him. And I read that Stieglitz had really said, if you want to have the career, if you want to be the great artist, you shouldn't have children, and don't have children. And I think, just to complicate, you said it was complicated, but I think this sort of sense of what is a woman, who is an artist, what is a loving relationship, how do you bring out the best in each other? I think that they were very sincere about all of those questions in some way. And I think there's some really complex unanswered questions around their relationship and gender.
I will also add, their relationship was quite passionate. Their letters are spicy. So I don't want to also sort of discount that aspect of it. Again, it was an intellectual partnership that was incredibly strong, but also it was very sort of romantic for her, even as it was a complicated one and he was having an affair and more than one. There's ways that he was offering her something that I think was really important.
Can I ask for one additional piece on this gender front? We briefly beforehand were chatting, and you mentioned something really interesting, Sarah, about her relationship with particularly second wave feminism. And I think that might be helpful too, to help round out this picture of how she thought about gender and also how she related with other people who were thinking about gender.
So this is not my research at all, but there is an amazing study called Equal Under the Sky by Linda Grasso that explores O'Keeffe's relationship to feminism, sort of feminism as it evolved, because of course feminism isn't static throughout the 20th century. And so you really see an artist who in the 1920s is absolutely, I think, committed to women's rights. Her best friend Anita Politzer is a dedicated suffragette and absolutely a power player in women's rights. And she's there, she's absolutely committed to that. But as her career progresses, and particularly around this idea of being the woman artist, that's where, when second wave feminism rolls around in the 1960s, she gets picked up as this icon, this sort of great artist who's great as a woman artist. And that's what she rejects. So she actually is not hugely fond of second wave feminism, and probably wouldn't have actually ever considered herself part of that group as a result of sort of the way that they were seeing rights as through gender as opposed to, not through gender. And so I think that that's interesting. But she becomes this icon. I mean, the fan mail starts pouring in the 1960s of all these women who are like, oh my God. I mean, think of Betty Friedan writing, essentially sort of, housewives writing to O'Keeffe and saying, I want to have your life. And so she's, I think, flattered by it, but at the same time, sort of wait a minute.
Hold your horses.
Yeah.
I think I want to start by just thanking each of our three speakers here. Please, if you'll join me. So appreciative. Thank you for giving us new insight into this incredible life and body of work. And please, go see the show before it leaves. Thank you all. Have a good evening.